Hey, thanks so much for checking out this video. What I'm going to do here in this video is actually take a look at the new BMW iX and sort of just break it down and give my feedback because I think there are a lot of points that are very interesting and perhaps even could be educational in some way. And I'm going to go at it from four different perspectives. So that's going to be branding, design, psychology, and finally usability or just the user experience. And again, I'll split it up. I'll start off with the interior and then go out to the exterior. Although I do have the majority of things that I want to address in the interior of the car. So let's get started. The first thing when you look into the interior that really becomes very obvious is that the car just in general looks like no other BMW in a lot of ways. And that's partly, from what I've been able to read, that was partly their goal, because they wanted to reinvent themselves, and apparently to do so visually, among other things. So the first part that I'm going to talk about is the screen. Now, first, the screen size to me is one part that's interesting to discuss. Now, the screen size, and I'm particularly talking about the infotainment screen, so the center control display, where you'll see things like the weather and media and the map. Now, while you can have a lot of visual access to things that are on the display while you're driving, I do believe that one potential area or one potential problem could be that the screen size is simply too small. Now, what I mean by that is that a lot of the functionalities that a lot of people expect from displays, particularly in the last couple of years, simply aren't possible on this display, right? I mean, the perfect counterexample to this are, of course, Teslas and their pretty much gigantic center control display, gigantic compared to this one. And so some of the things that you simply, as far as I can tell, can't really do well on this small display are things like reading a browser or watching videos or perhaps even movies, or perhaps even playing games. Who knows what you want to be able to do, or just using all four fingers, or all five fingers rather, to interact with it. Maybe even multi-touch. I don't know if this has multi-touch, but that's not really the point. The point is that the size of the display effectively doesn't even most likely make the driver or passenger want to use it in an iPad-like fashion, because it's just too small for those sorts of things. And so that's not really too big, or it doesn't appear to be too big of a problem. But you have to look at the fact that this BMW model is intended to pave the way for the next 100 years of BMW cars. It's supposed to pave the way for the future. And as we've seen in the past, the functionalities that touchscreens take on have radically increased a lot, to the point where now you can pretty much do everything on an iPad. Like, you could literally, if you're in a job where you need to work with a computer daily, you could do pretty much everything that you need to do for work on an iPad without even using a pen or a keyboard, a physical one. So the point is, displays and touchscreens are taking on a lot more functionality, and we're sort of merging more as humans with the touchscreens, to the point where we want to do more things on it that were previously not possible on it, such as playing games, watching movies, reading entire articles on the internet, viewing files, those sorts of things. And I believe that the size of the infotainment screen in this car, in this iX, simply doesn't allow for that. And so it doesn't pave the way very well for the next 100 years from this perspective. So what I want to talk about now is just the one potential problem area where the two screens are turning into one another and are merging. And you'll see it quite well on this photo that I have up on the screen here. If you look at the center screen and you look to the left side of it, where you have the map, and then further to the left you have what seems to be four icons listed vertically, starting off with menu, and then you have media, and then you have the phone symbol, And then below that, there's one more symbol that's cut off by the steering wheel. So it's not visible from the driver's seat in this picture. And that appears to be a huge problem, because if it's not visible in this picture, then it stands to reason that there are going to be instances where certain parts of the infotainment screen are not going to be visible to the driver while driving, depending on the body size, the height, the sitting, how the driver is sitting at the moment, how he's holding the steering wheel. And to me, the fact that it is not possible to see the entirety of the infotainment screen at all points in time throughout any drive is really bad. Like, the infotainment screen carries a lot of really important functionalities and information, and the driver absolutely needs to be able to see it from any position, no matter how he holds the steering wheel, no matter how he's sitting. The driver has got to be able to see it. And this picture makes me think that there's no guarantee that will be the case. And so in essence, they're sort of forcing themselves to, or BMW is creating, in a way, these issues simply because they want to stick to the concept of this curved display, because that's actually what's creating the issue. If they said, you know what, let's have two displays. Let's have one information display behind the steering wheel and a separate display just in the center of the car for infotainment, then that issue wouldn't exist. If nothing else, even if the driver doesn't block certain parts of the control display with the wheel or with their hands as they're steering the wheel, doesn't mean that it still won't make for anxiety or perhaps even annoyance, simply out of the anticipation that perhaps the driver might be blocking certain parts of the control display with their hands or with the wheel. So to me, at least, this would be a little bit of a source of anxiety, to always make sure I don't hold my hands in a way that would block the control display, which is just unnecessary in my opinion. So next I'm going to talk about the center console. Now, the center console is very different on this BMW indeed. I'm actually going to put up a photo right here so you can see what I'm talking about. What we can see is that it sort of has this feeling of hovering, right? Because it's not connected by any transmission tunnel anymore. So with this design, BMW got rid of the transmission tunnel between the cockpit or the dashboard and the center console. And that seems to be an interesting concept at first, but I'm going to actually talk about why I think this causes more issues than benefits. The first thing that I thought of right away when I saw it is, if there's a free storage space down below between the driver's leg space and the passenger's leg space, then what's automatically going to happen in many cases? People are going to store items there, whether it's purses or bags or anything else for that matter. It's going to be used for storage, and there's no way around that. And the fact that it's open, the fact that there's no compartment or nothing to keep the storage from falling over or from sliding in the car, obviously creates the potential hazard that while driving, certain storage elements that are stored before the center console on the floor will slide over into the legroom of the driver and then possibly interfere with the driver properly being able to use the pedals, being able to accelerate or slow down. And that could be a really big problem when you think about it. Imagine some purse or some whatever, your kid's skateboard or something, slides into your legroom while you're driving down the road with 150 kilometers an hour, and you can't brake because it's blocking the brake pedal. Like, this is obviously like a really big problem when you think about it. And it could be solved quite easily if they just had a tiny storage unit or some sort of element, some sort of separation element that keeps things from falling into the driver's legroom. So that's the first obvious problem. Now, the next thing I want to talk about with the lack of a transmission tunnel is simply that it is effectively non-usable space of the car. So it's not like you could use it for any functional purpose, right? We already established that it's not smart to use it for storage purposes. And so you can't really do anything else with it other than perhaps place your feet in it or part of one foot in it. And so it gives the driver or passenger more leg room. However, what they're doing by eliminating the center tunnel completely is they're also taking away a very important storage unit, right? This part of the car could be perfect, as we can see, for example, in Teslas, for small to medium-sized items to be stored. So, for example, phones, wallets, car keys, right? House keys or other small elements, but also certain medium-sized elements or things like laptops or tablets or things of that nature, or perhaps even purses and bags. Now, the fact that they take it away means people are going to have to find a different way to place these items. They're going to either have to place them in the glove compartment, which is less user-friendly, or they're going to have to place it in the doors, or they're perhaps going to have to place it in the little compartment that's, inside the glove compartment that can be opened with a button, which again is less comfortable. And so they're taking away a really important functional element, but for what purpose? So you have to ask yourself, what's more important? The fact that the car looks more open and free, or the fact that people can store their belongings easily in the center tunnel? In my opinion, it's quite clear that storage and practical functional usage is far more important, especially in a SAV, right, where you might be taking your entire family on vacation. One thing I want to add here about this quick storage, which is actually kind of funny, is the fact that what they were trying to create, and this is based on their own information, what BMW was trying to create is, and I have it here, a space that conveys relaxation, quality of life, and a feeling of being a favorite place. So in other words, they were trying to create a space where you can feel extremely comfortable. It's like your favorite space. You want to hang out in the car even when you're not driving it. That's what they were aiming for. But to me, if I can't even store my belongings easily and conveniently in my favorite space, then it's not going to be my favorite space, because it's going to be filled with probably like annoyance that I can't just put my phone down without worrying that it'll fall to the floor. So that totally goes against the concept of creating a favorite space in essence. I mean, just think about it. When you get into a car, and you almost always have certain belongings with you, whether it's a bag or anything. Let's imagine you have your phone, your wallet, your car keys, and your house keys in your hand or whatever. So when you have all these belongings in your hands and you get into the car and you just settle, you turn on the engine, what's the first thing you want to do with all those belongings? Or what do you usually do? You place them somewhere. You put them in the center console or on the passenger seat or whatever. You just want to place them somewhere conveniently and safely. And now imagine what you'd have to do in the iX when you get into the car and you have those belongings with you. Just think about it. Most likely what would happen, if it was me, I would get into the car, I'd have these things in my hands, and what I would probably have to do is either put them on the passenger seat, in which case I would worry that they fall down when I drive, or I have to put them in a little compartment that's on the center console where you push the button and the thing's open, you put it in, you close it back up. But then again, that's work, and that's like 3 or 4 steps I have to take just to release myself of those items, just to get rid of them. Or I could put them down below under the center console where you have the charging port and the cup holders. But again, I take my items and I go like down below, right? Which is a completely inconvenient behavior or action to do. And it's not just as easy as placing them. So again, it's not really user-friendly. And from a usability standpoint, yes, it's effective. It can do what it's supposed to do, but it's not really efficient. And it's also not really satisfactory. So, satisfying. So that's one problem with the center console. Now I'm going to focus a little bit more on the front part of the center console where you have all the buttons and stuff. So let's talk first about the gear shift. Now the gear shift certainly looks new and unique and impressive in a lot of ways. However, I also think there's some issues here because of the mere design of it, the design and the usability. What's important to consider is that one of the main goals that BMW had with this car was to convey minimalism and modernism and even futurism. And to me, minimalism and modernism just don't compute with the design of the gear shift. When you look at the gear shift, what you see is a really complex lowered element. So it's really sort of three-dimensional. It's not just on one surface. It goes down, and it's not going down and then it's an even surface further down, but it sort of edges down a little bit, a few inches. And then you have several, like you have these two buttons in the back, and it's a really a non-symmetrical, bumpy shape with a lot of edges and corners. Really complex, really. And so while it doesn't look bad necessarily, it seems to go against the goal of minimalism quite strongly. For example, if you look at, and I'm actually going to compare this in some cases to Tesla, but only when it's required and only when we're talking about minimalism, because obviously one of the goals of Tesla is certainly minimalism in their cars. When you look at the Tesla, they simply have the gear shift on one of the levers behind the steering wheel, where you don't even see that there is a gear shift. And that to me is minimalism, when you don't even see the thing is there, but you know it's there and you know how to get there. And that's obviously not been achieved at all here. Now, and then from a functional perspective, from a usability perspective, it also seems to me to be quite non-user friendly, because in order to shift a gear, you have to essentially take two fingers, your index finger and your thumb, in most cases, and place them in front of you and then tilt backwards and forward, which is not the most convenient action that you could use to shift gears. In fact, it would be much more user-friendly, much more convenient to have the regular gear shift that has been around in the past few BMWs, where you can actually grab I forgot what it's called, but you can grab a gear shift with your hand and then shift it. That's much more convenient of a movement and much easier to grab as well, because it's larger and more ergonomic than this little tiny lever that we have in the BMW iX. So both from a minimalism, which is design standpoint, and from a usability standpoint, this gear shift just isn't as good as it could be. Now, how I would solve this, I already sort of said it, is I would just put the gear shift onto one of the levers behind the steering wheel. That to me is the most minimalistic way of solving that problem. Although there are other ways, of course. Next, what I want to talk about, this is one of my favorite parts actually, is the wooden part. So the controls with which you can control parts of the infotainment screen, right? Like you have menu, you have phone, you have media, and some other buttons as well, as you can see in the photo. Now, I must admit, it looks really cool. Like it looks really impressive and really fancy in a lot of ways. Like there's absolutely no doubt about that. But what's important to consider is actually quite simple. Let me start off with the actual buttons, the one that say media and tel and nav and so on. Now, they are essentially sensors. Well, I've never used the car, so it's hard for me to say if when you touch them with your finger, that for you to, whether you can feel that there are buttons there, or whether it's more like a touch screen where you cannot distinguish a button from a non-button simply by feeling them. Now, I don't know which one it is, but the fact that they consider this to be shy tech and simply sensors instead of buttons makes me think that it is more like a touchscreen where you don't feel the buttons, where you cannot distinguish them from the surface simply by feeling. So, and if that's the case, then quite obviously there's a huge issue, right? You have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 buttons. Maybe more, maybe less. I've never used the car. But imagine you're driving really fast, like 100 miles or something, 100 miles an hour. And you want to change something on the infotainment screen. Let's say you want to go to tel for telephone. What do? You take your right hand and you look for the tel button on the center console, but without looking at it, of course. Because if you were to look at it and you're driving 100 miles an hour or 160 kilometers an hour, then that's not really safe. And it's probably not what BMW intended for the driver to have to do. So you take your right hand and you move your finger somewhere where you think the tel button would be located. But now think what would happen. You simply wouldn't know whether you have it or whether you will press the right button or not. You don't know where it is because there's no haptic feedback and there's just no sensory feedback at all that you have actually reached the right button on the surface. So in other words, you have to do one of two things. You either have to just press and hope you got the right button and then continue to press somewhere on the surface and hope you get the right button eventually, because you'll see it on the infotainment screen when you did, or you have to take your eyes off the road and look so that you have visual and sensory feedback and you can actually push the right button. Now, besides being unsafe to do that while you're driving, it's also just inconvenient and annoying. Even when you're not driving, and even when you're just driving very slowly, or if you're the passenger in the car, it's like, why do I have to take the extra step of looking at the thing in order to know that I got the right button, right? I get it. It's a different thing if the screen is right in your face. Like, for example, the infotainment screen. It's not a big problem, and it's not a lot of work either to look at it because it's right in your field of view. But these buttons are not in your field of view. You actually have to, when you're sitting straight, you have to look down, look at the button, press them, and then look back at the street or whatever you were looking at. So it's inconvenient. It's basically what it comes down to. Inconvenient and unsafe in some cases. And so the background from that, or the background knowledge, or the valuable piece of knowledge to extract from that is essentially this. What BMW is trying to do with these buttons is they're trying to create a touchscreen-like surface that works essentially in the same way that a touchscreen works. The only difference being that there's no pixels, and so one button is always dedicated to one functionality and to be in one space at one time. It's always the same. But from a functional perspective, they're essentially trying to create a touchscreen interaction where you push a button and there's no sensory feedback because it's all one surface. But the thing is that a touchscreen inherently requires, in order to be used properly, inherently requires there to be both a finger and an eye or two eyes involved. So you have to, in any touchscreen, look at the surface and touch the surface because there is an eye-finger coordination. You see something on the screen that you want to touch, that you want to click on, and then you move your finger there. That's the only way touchscreens work. If you look at how you use your phone or perhaps your tablet or any other touchscreen, that's how touchscreens work. Now, I know there are some cases where you don't always look at the touchscreen. For example, when you're typing really fast, and you're typing a message to someone really fast on your phone, you sort of know by memory where the buttons are roughly located. But again, you have visual feedback because you're looking at the text that you've entered. And if you see that you made a mistake, you can then quickly look to the keyboard within a millisecond and correct the mistake. And that's not the case here. And even if you can correct a mistake here on this BMW, it's an unnecessary mistake that will cause annoyance and frustration and perhaps even make the driving experience unsafe. So solution for that has to probably be I think there's two ways. Number one, just get rid of the buttons and put them on create a larger infotainment screen, a larger control display, as they call it, and put all the functionality on this display. Number two, actually I think there are three options. Number two, put them on the steering wheel. You can see them very easily on the steering wheel. And number three, just make them physical. Give them a shape and edges and make the shapes and edges different. The buttons look and feel different from one another. Then you can touch them, and just with your finger alone, you can make out what button is located where and whether you got the right button or not. Right, and then finally, and this is also to me, gosh, it's just so obvious that this isn't the best solution out there. And like all you have to do is, like literally all you have to do is look at any other car on the market, pretty much any other car, and imagine yourself being in it and driving it, or even sitting in it. And it's just so easy. And I'm talking about the storage unit that is below the center console, sort of like the second level of the center console. And so what you have done there is, it seems to be 2 phone chargers, wireless chargers, and then 2 cup holders, along with there's also, I forgot what it's called, but it's an auxiliary power adapter plug thingy. And it also seems to be that there's a USB adapter as well. Whether you have a phone or a drink, why force your users to take the extra step of placing them down below and making them have to take this awkward movement, rather than just placing them on top? You know, not only is it inconvenient, but it could also cause issues, right? Imagine you have a hot coffee placed in the cup holder down below, and you're driving and you're trying to reach it, and after doing the awkward movement, you pull it out, and because it's under another surface, although I admit it's not exactly under it, it's sort of moved a little bit forward, but still there's another surface above it. The chances are you're gonna knock it against the top of the center console at least a few times, and that you're gonna perhaps spill your drink on yourself, which again can cause a safety hazard for the driver, and just be an unnecessary annoyance. And even if that doesn't happen, again, why force the driver and passenger to have to grab down below, where it's a little harder, even just a little harder to reach than if it was up on top? And why do that to things that people really need a lot when they're driving, right? Like your phone, for example, when you're a passenger, or other belongings. You know, who says you won't place your mints or your snack bars down there as well? And of course your drinks. You know, if you have a drink in there, chances are you're gonna want to drink it every few minutes or so. So to me, this is, from a usability standpoint, just not satisfying at all, and even hurts the experience quite strongly. Now, certainly there are ways in which you can place and take your cup or your phone very easily without bumping it into anything, no problem. But again, why create the possibility that issues arise? Why even give your users that possibility? And not everybody always uses products, of course, in exactly the way they were intended to be used. You don't actually take your drink and get it out this way so you can grab it. You just take the quickest and fastest route from the cup holder to your mouth, in which case you might knock it against the center console. Okay, and what's important about this too is that, again, think about the fact that BMW was trying to create a favorite place, a place of relaxation and comfort, where you just wanna hang out in there even when you're not driving, right? Like, this is just so not the case at all with this design. I would get frustrated after using it twice, and then I wouldn't want to spend any time in it, and I would definitely not call it my favorite place, right? A simple table in my home would be more comfortable because I could just place a drink on it and grab it without having to worry about knocking it anywhere. And the other thing is that this has been a common practice in any other car on the market, and in any other BMW especially. Cup holder on top, put your drink in, grab it when you need it. It's like, it really seems like they're making it less user-friendly for some reason. And so again, the solution obviously to this problem would be, quite simply, to just put the cup holders on top. Perhaps scratch the idea of getting rid of the transmission tunnel, and so you have some storage for those sorts of things, for phones and keys and drinks and other belongings of that sort, because you just need it. You know, when you're a driver or a passenger, you just need those things. They're so crucial. One more thing I want to say about the center console is quite funny actually. So this is on the German BMW website where they're introducing this car, and I'm gonna have to translate it to you. But they're essentially saying that the free-floating center console almost seems like a coffee table of a luxurious boutique hotel. Now think about that. Think about a coffee table of a luxurious boutique hotel. What is one characteristic of a coffee table of a luxurious boutique hotel that this center console doesn't have? I'll give you a second to think about it. No, in fact, I'll tell you. It's obviously because a table in a luxurious boutique hotel, a coffee table, what's the main purpose of a table is that you can place things on them. You can place things on tables. That's all that tables are about from a functional standpoint. You can't place anything on the center console because there's no storage for it, unlike in every other car on the entire planet, right? So it's like, no, it doesn't seem like the coffee table of a luxurious boutique hotel. Not in any way at all. Like, perhaps it might look like it a little bit, but anybody who gets into the car and drives it for a second will see that, no, not at all. This more or less seems like just a really clunky control panel, not a coffee table. Next, I'm going to talk about the steering wheel, right? The steering wheel, also totally new shape than ever before. And I'm going to split this up into two sections, at least if I'm not mistaken. 3 sections, actually. Starting out with the overall shape of it and what that conveys. Now, the shape is more hexagonal and it feels more square-like. And what they were going for, based on what they claim, is to make it more comfortable to use. So it's easier to get in and it's easier to use and it makes better use of the space or something like that. But there are some issues, obviously, that go along with that. The first one is that ultimately the square-like design of the wheel makes it just look bigger than it really is, which takes away from the concept of minimalism. Second, the very big gaps on the top where you can see the control display, the information display, as well as the gap on the bottom where you can hold the wheel, seem really big, like a lot bigger than in pretty much any other steering wheel, which again makes it seem bigger than it really is. The centerpiece of the steering wheel, the horn, also seems very large and like really in your face, and largely because of its size, but also because of its three-dimensional shape. It seems like it's bulging toward the driver when it's like, again, I'll sum it up in a second, but so that's a fact. And again, that makes it look larger than it really is. And it makes it feel sort of aggressive even. And finally, the panels on the left and the right with the multifunctional buttons on them seem large, and they primarily seem large simply because of the design and the height of them. And to me, again, that does not convey minimalism. So all of these things, all of these factors show or explain why the steering wheel just seems a lot larger than in most other cars, even than in previous BMWs. And the fact that it appears larger on all these accounts completely goes against the goal of minimalism. Because when you think about it, minimalism should be a feeling of as little as possible, but yet still everything is there. So it should look as though there's not enough, or it should look as though there are less elements than there really are, and that things are very minimalistic from a visual standpoint, meaning the shapes, the edges, the corners, the buttons, the sizes, everything is as minimalistic, as thin and simplistic as possible. And that's just not really the case here at all. Like, just think about how much more minimalistic the wheel and the entire interior, for that matter, would feel if the steering wheel was just round, right? That alone, in my opinion, would make such a huge difference. Okay, let's talk about the buttons. The buttons on the panels also have some issues connected with them. they simply don't convey minimalism, and they simply seem to be sticking to how things have always been in BMWs rather than reinventing the concept of buttons on a steering wheel, especially since reinventing is something that BMW claims of itself as it relates to these new I models, right? Paving the way for the next 100 years. Number one, the lack of symmetry on the left and right panels leads to more cognitive load and draws more attention to it, which again goes against the concept of minimalism. Minimalism would be that there are buttons, but you're not drawn to them because they just look perfectly symmetrical and perfectly less in your face than in other cars. It's a little hard to explain, but that's basically what it comes down to. So what I mean by the lack of symmetry is that it simply appears as though there are more buttons than there really are, which goes against minimalism. So if you look at the left panel, and in the center of it, you have a little switch that has a plus and a minus on it. Now, if you look to the right panel, you have another round icon, or another round button, rather, but it's a different button. It's a wheel that you can actually spin, and there's a two arrows on each side, one on each side, and which is completely different, right? So that's one area where they're not symmetrical. When you look at all the other buttons on the right panel, on the top you have a plus and minus. On the left side you only have set. On the right side you have one icon on each side of the little wheel, and on the left side you only have one icon, which is on the left of the switch. Now, I know this is not really that, seems to not be that big of an issue, but the more, or the less symmetry and the more items and icons there are, the more the design seems to be filled with stuff. Just when you look at it, all you see is there's a lot. Rather than in a minimalistic design, you would think, wow, where is everything? And so that's why this all goes against minimalism. And it could be so easily avoided, in my opinion, right? Just use the same round elements on both sides, either the same switch or the same wheel, and maybe use a less obvious color or thinner icons on the panels, so there's not that big of a contrast. Which again, the more contrast and the bigger the icons, the more it appears like, oh, there's a lot and it's in your face. One more thing I want to talk about is towards the bottom left of the wheel. So it's on the actual cockpit. Right below the vents on the left side, you have buttons that seem to be for adjusting the forward beams in some manner, maybe turning them on or something like that. I'm not sure what it is again. And to me, it's like, one thing that's very obvious again is that it goes against the concept of minimalism. Again, minimalism would be, you look at it and you're like, where are all the buttons? Where's all the function? Where's all the functionality? Because you would think there's too little functionality. But here, you actually have buttons all over the place. You have buttons on the center console, you have buttons on the wheel, you have buttons on the cockpit, you have buttons on the control display, you have buttons on the door, you have buttons everywhere, you have buttons on the top. And it's like, this is not minimalism at all, and not in any way. And again, it's confusing for the user who expects to see minimalism. But even if their goal hadn't been minimalism, I still believe that if they're so keen on reinventing themselves, and I keep saying they, but obviously I mean BMW, if they're so keen on reinventing themselves, and especially having this car pave the way for the next 100 years, then why not reinvent everything and simply make it more minimalistic, right? The advent of technology, or the development of technology, should mean that things get easier, which means less buttons and more connecting of functionality, or just less stuff. And that's a trend that you can see anywhere where technology is well, in most places where technology is advancing. So it would have been very easy, in my opinion, to just move these 3 buttons somewhere else, just anywhere else. Put them on the center, on the infotainment screen. Put them on the steering wheel. Put them on one of the levers behind the steering wheel. It's like so many options to make the whole thing look more minimalistic. Let's move on to some other issues. First of all, the glove compartment. Now, again, you can already sort of guess, I believe, what the issue is about with the glove compartment. And it is, of course, again, about minimalism and simply not being in line with the visual and branding goals of the car, because those goals were minimalism, futurism, and favorite place, among others. But when you look at the glove compartment, first of all, the glove compartment itself is very visual because of the clearly visible edges. But then also the lever to open it, which is located right to the left of it, is very, very visible and very big and physical. And how does a big physical lever in a brand new futuristic car convey minimalism and futurism? It doesn't at all. And it would have been so easy, in my opinion, to just make it a very tiny button, maybe put it next to the vents, the center air vents, where you already have 2 or 3 buttons. And it's a tiny little button, you click it and it opens. And when you use it, you should think to yourself, wow, I didn't even see that coming, because you couldn't see where the glove compartment even is. That would be the goal of minimalism. So, which hasn't been achieved here. Okay, just a few more elements to go. Next, I'm going to talk about just the glass elements. There's a lot of glass elements in this car. So, for example, on the center console, you have 3. You have the gear shift, and then a little iDrive touch controller, as well as the controller or the wheel for adjusting the volume. And then you also have them on the doors to adjust the seating position. Now, they look great, they look luxurious, they look amazing. But from a practical standpoint, again, when you have glass elements, you got to expect that they're going to scratch or even crack in the worst case scenario eventually. Unless it's a really good glass, of course. But if anything, even in the worst case scenario, you're going to get scratches on them, especially in the places that they are. Now, being that they're really fancy looking glass controllers, you're obviously drawn to them visually. You're drawn to looking at them. When they have cracks or scratches on them, you'll be turned off. You'll be like thinking, well, that doesn't look so luxurious. So again, this is a small issue, but I think it needs to be addressed because it's such an obvious thing that'll happen. A few things I want to mention about the seating. Number 1, where you actually change the seating position, so the seat regulation buttons on the doors. Now, again, I haven't been in the car. So this is a claim that I'm making simply based on what I can see in photos and videos. But to me, it seems that the location of where these buttons are and their size is really uncomfortable to use. Again, I haven't been in the car, so you could fight me on that. But it seems to me like if I have to move my hand onto the left side of the door to move it forward and backward or up and down, it's just an inconvenient movement, at least far less convenient than if you just grab down to the side of the seat where they're usually located. So again, in terms of looks and design, this car definitely is better off than previous BMWs. But in terms of functionality and usability, I wouldn't say so. The next thing I want to talk about is the seating, the head restraint. As you'll see on the photo, they have this little cutout, this little rectangle cutout on the seats, on the front seats. And apparently the purpose of it is partially design and partially you have the option to install sound in there. I think they call it 4D sound, so 4-dimensional, just giving you this sense of space in a way. Again, that's based on the information that I was able to find. But let's think about that for a second. If you're sitting in the seat, and again, I haven't been in the car, but to me, it quite strongly seems to be the case that depending on your body type, some part of your backside, either your head or your neck, or even if you're really tall, your shoulder area, will in some cases touch this part, this piece, which if it does, might not be too comfortable because it's hard and because maybe it's even cold. You know, if it's cold outside and this is made of steel, then it might be very uncomfortable. So again, it's like, why even put an element in there that might cause discomfort for the user when it's not all too necessary from a functional standpoint. So now I want to talk about the grille. Now, here's the thing. The grille on this car obviously seems extremely large and larger than on many, many other cars and many other BMWs, if not all BMWs. Now, the interesting thing about this grille is that it's essentially non-functional. Now, I have heard that it does have certain functions, that certain sensors are located within it. But I simply doubt that there are any sensors that are as big as that entire grille. So even if there are sensors, I'm sure there would have been better ways of hiding them than putting them behind this gigantic grille. But again, I could be wrong. But the more important point is what it conveys from a brand and design perspective. And to explain what I mean, I'm actually going to use an analogy that's very similar to this situation. Basically, what BMW seems to be doing here is they're taking what used to be a functional element in the past, right? The grille used to have a very important function or still does have an important function in internal combustion engine cars. But now it doesn't, because this car doesn't have an internal combustion engine. So again, the function of the element is gone, but the design of it is still here. So it's like, that makes you think, why, if the function is gone, would you still include the design element that used to house the function? So in order to sort of imagine what I mean by that, let's look at iPhones. So if you think back to what iPhones before the iPhone X looked like, they used to have home buttons on the bottom. And there was an entire area below the screen that was essentially non-usable because it was just housing the home button. And they changed that. Actually I should say that this design of the iPhone, where you have the home button on the bottom, then you have a rectangular touchscreen, and then on the top you have just microphone and speaker and a camera. That design had become very iconic before the iPhone X or iPhone 10. I don't know which one is right. This design had become iconic, and it had reached a certain brand status for Apple, whereas like so many people knew, the vast majority of people alive knew this design was Apple. So it was really great the way that they included the functional element, the function of the home button, into the design of the phone. Was very great and really beneficial from a branding perspective. So with the iPhone 10, they decided that they no longer needed the home button, because they would just use gestures in order to close apps. Now, when you think about that, so the functional element would be gone. The home button was no longer needed, starting with the iPhone 10. So now Apple had two choices. First choice, keep the design the same. In other words, keep the home button on there, but just make it non-functional. Or even another alternative to that would be get rid of the home button, but leave the unusable section on the bottom, and not turn it into touchscreen. The other option number 2 that they had was, well, if we get rid of the function, then we should also adapt the design to the lack of this function. And that's what they did, and it ended up working for them. They extended the display, as we all know, to almost the entirety of the front of the side of the phone. And the reason why it worked for them is because within just a year, within just the first generation of this new design, it had already reached iconic cult status again. It was already a brand element that everybody across the globe knew, that's Apple, so it worked for them, and it didn't hurt their brand, and it didn't hurt their visual identity at all. So when you pay attention to what Apple did, you'll see that a functional element was no longer needed. They got rid of the functional element. But rather than keeping the design the same, they adjusted the design to the new functional layout, to the new functional elements on the phone, which was the right thing to do, because now you have a better user experience because you have a bigger screen. And you have, again, an iconic status. And it helped your brand identity as well, because people were able to see how committed Apple is to creating the best user experience, to the point where they're completely redesigning their phones. Now, let's look back at BMW. BMW also had, all cars for that matter, have a functional element, which is the grille. I'm not an engineer. I don't know enough about the technological side of cars, or technical side, but I do know that the grille has a very important functional purpose on internal combustion engine cars, which is, as far as I know, primarily to let in air that would in some way cool the engine. I don't know, but I knew it had a functional aspect to it. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been around in the way it's been. So anyway, the functional element with the iX was no longer needed. So BMW, again, just like Apple, had a choice. Are we going to keep the design element of it, or are we going to get rid of it? And they chose, obviously, to keep it. Now, if we apply the same logic to Apple, imagine if you have an iPhone newer than the iPhone X or the iPhone X. Imagine you still had the same size and dimension and proportions of the old screen. But so the bottom and the top of the phone, of the front of the phone, would be unusable glass elements that you can't use. That's because that's where the home button used to be. That would not be smart. That would be stupid. Now, I need to say that obviously you cannot just make the analogy with iPhones and say BMW has to do it the same way, because cars are different than phones, of course. But the essence of it still holds truth and value, because what BMW is essentially doing with this design on the iX is, in a way, they're limiting the design possibilities for the iX to the design, to the functional elements of other BMWs. So they're limiting the abilities they have in terms of design to what used to be functional requirements, which is like, might make you ask yourself, why would I limit myself at all in my design to elements that don't even have functional value anymore? It just doesn't seem smart. Now, I understand, of course, at least I think I do, why BMW chose to do this. And it must obviously be related to their visual brand identity. They want people essentially to know that's a BMW, just based on the grills, because it has become a very iconic part of their visual brand identity over the past 100 years or so, or more. So I get that aspect of it completely. But again, it's like, it seems, first of all, it seems not smart, and second, it seems avoidable to have your design be that limited by certain design elements like that, especially when you're creating the visual identity, or reinventing the visual identity for the next 100 years, as they always claim, or for the future. Because again, this car, by BMW's own admission, is intended, or is supposed to, pave the way for the future. So the question becomes, or the question that arises is, why take elements from the last 100 years into the next 100 years when they have absolutely no functional value? And that can obviously become a problem. Now you could say, well, if they did it differently, they would lose their visual brand identity. And so that would be very bad. And it would be bad if they lost their visual brand identity, of course. But I don't think they would. I think if they designed the car differently, they wouldn't lose their visual brand identity. And the reason for that is, look at the iPhone, right? They did it. Or for example, another example in the car industry is the Ford Mustang Mach-E, the first electric Mustang ever. The Mustang also used to have a rather large grille that was a very important part of the visual brand identity of Mustangs. Not as important as other parts of it, but still quite important. If you look at pictures of other older Mustangs, you'll see what I mean. I'll put one up on the screen. But their Mach-E doesn't have, at least I think the blue or the red version I saw, doesn't have that big grille at all anymore. It doesn't. All it has is little sleek lines that sort of indicate or hint at the fact that there used to be a grille there. So, and this seems to be a perfect transition away from grills and into a future where there are no grills, where maybe the next or the model after the next of this Mustang has absolutely no lines indicating any grille, because in 5 or 10 years from now, maybe that's not going to be necessary anymore. Maybe they could then completely get rid of any grille design without at all hurting their visual brand identity. So again, at this point, this seems to be about prioritizing. What's more important, the brand identity or reinventing yourself for the future? And like, obviously there's these, both of them are important. But I think the route that the Ford Mustang Mach-E took is the best route to go. It's like, you can't, of course, completely get rid of very important design elements of your product, even if they don't have functions anymore. Well, in some cases perhaps, but generally it's hard to do that because you would really impact the visual brand identity of your product, which again reflects your company as well. But you have to find some sort of compromise, because ultimately, in this case, we are moving away from grills. There's no doubt about that. And it doesn't seem like the BMW iX found any compromise. In fact, rather than going into a direction that's more grill-less in the future, they ended up making the grill much larger than on the majority of BMWs, and putting very complex designs inside of it, these little squares or shapes that just make you have to look at it, and that are so in your face. The entire design is so in your face that it's like it doesn't go away from the grills at all. And to me, the problem that I see with this is simply that BMW is limiting their future visual brand identity to functional elements that used to be functional in the past but are not functional anymore. And that is not smart at all. Rather, what you should try to do, and what this BMW should have tried to do, is make the rest of the car, meaning the design of it, the shapes, the proportions, the elements, the colors, the design of the headlights, for example, and everything, make the entirety of the rest of the design such that it becomes, or such that it has the potential to become, the new visual brand identity for what BMWs look like in the next 100 years. And if you do that, or if they did that, then they would no longer be forced to include the grille into the design in order to convey the same visual brand identity. In fact, they could probably get rid of the grille and people would still know that it's a BMW. All of this would allow BMW to completely rebrand themselves for the future of transportation, which I believe should be the goal of this BMW iX, since this is the car that is supposed to pave the way for the future. And since BMW claimed of themselves that they're constantly trying to reinvent themselves, which is actually written very big on the German website that introduces the BMW iX. So this is my these are my thoughts on the grille design. So the final thing I want to address is the concept of minimalism on the exterior of the car. So while BMW didn't claim that certain specific parts of the exterior were intended to be minimalistic in design, they did claim on their official German website, and I'm gonna translate and tell you. They did say that the spaces, the proportions, and the details are perfectly integrated into the body, and thus make for a very minimalistic design character. Now, in some cases I agree, in some cases I strongly disagree, and I want to talk about how I disagree and in which cases. The first way in which I disagree, and I'll put it up on the video, is again the grille. I actually just talked about the grille, but I want to talk about it again here very shortly in this section of minimalism. Now, simply the grille isn't minimalistic at all. It seems way too large, way out of proportion. It's got very complex designs in the center of it. So inside of it there are these diamond shaped shapes that are fading from the center to the outside and becoming smaller, and they're really complex, which is not minimalistic. Now also the grille has a lot of edges and corners and is very like three-dimensional, sort of a little bit bulging out at the viewer, and it makes it seem like there's a lot more going on than there really is, which is not minimalistic in my opinion. Maybe it appears minimalistic to other people. The other not so minimalistic aspect of the exterior are the door handles. Now, when you look at the door handles, you'll see that they essentially have two colors. They're essentially two elements, at least based on what they look like. There's an outer part and an inner part, and they look similar, the outer part and inner part, but they're not exactly the same shape. The inner part is a little bit smaller and shorter. Now, to me, a commitment to minimalism means doing one's best to take out as much as possible in terms of elements, shapes, and colors and design. Or maybe not design, but just as little as possible. And the fact that the door handles have two colors and are essentially two elements rather than just one is simply not minimalistic. It would have been very easy to make it one element, to make it black perhaps. And this is again something that you can see on a Tesla. The door handles, one color, very minimalistic. And that's what BMW, in my opinion, should have gone for.